Washington gets elected to a second term. So question, what were the major events or challenges of his second term, and what warnings did he leave for future leaders? There are going to be some significant foreign policy issues in Washington's second term. And let's be honest, like most of what has happened so far, it's because of Britain and France. So in 1793, they start fighting each other, and there's this question, should we get involved? And if we get involved, which side should we be on? Now it's important to keep in mind both Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson used to be the minister to France. Jefferson can identify with the French, and he goes, oh, they're dealing with liberty like we dealt with liberty. We should support them. And Hamilton's like, man, we do a lot of trading with England. It would really suck if we didn't have them as a trading partner. And so they're quibbling over this in the cabinet. And ultimately, Washington says no, and he goes with the Proclamation of Neutrality. And basically what he's saying is, we're not going to get involved at all. We are but a little baby country, and we need to focus on ourselves. We need to build ourselves up bigger and stronger before we wade in on other people's issues. Now, Britain and France don't take this line down. Britain is going to start impressing sailors, which is not like, oh my gosh, wow. It's like kidnapping. So basically, Britain is threatening and taking our sailors. And so we face a bit of a situation of, okay, but you can't just let that happen. They're also provoking Native Americans into attacking Western settlers. So we will reach an agreement with Britain. It's called Jay's Treaty, and people hated it. Basically, it says Britain is going to leave America and stop being involved in our day-to-day affairs, but they believe they still have the right to seize American cargo bound for French ports because they're at war with France. And so America's kind of upset about this. This isn't a great move by Washington. There's also going to be Pinkney's Treaty, which is between us and the Spanish. It establishes the northern border of Spanish Florida, and we get access to New Orleans so that we can access the Mississippi River. A domestic problem that Washington is going to face is called the Whiskey Rebellion. So remember back in the other video, Hamilton came up with a tax on whiskey. And guess what? People don't like it. So there's a 25% excise tax on whiskey. And we can go like, oh, well, whiskey, you don't need it to live, so who cares? But it's a little bit deeper than that. One, people don't like taxes. So generally, there's that. But secondly, poor farmers, and especially Western Pennsylvania, this was the way they made money. They live far away from trading outposts, and it's really difficult because there's no roads. They can't transport their grain to go sell it, and if they do, it could be spoiled by the time they get there, and it's cumbersome. But what they can do is they can turn that into whiskey, and then the whiskey can be kept in barrels, and it stays good forever, and everyone likes whiskey. People will buy it, and that's how they're making money, and they feel that this tax hurts them the most, these poorer farmers. So they refuse to pay it, and they start a rebellion. Now, it's important to keep in mind the similarities between the Whiskey Rebellion and Shay's Rebellion. You have poorer people upset about something that is being done to hurt them, so they rebel against the government. We couldn't do anything in Shay's Rebellion because we didn't have the Constitution. But now we have the Constitution, and Washington quite literally goes in his attic, he throws on his uniform, and he leads the army to Western Pennsylvania. And they hang them some people. Washington shuts this rebellion down with violence, squashes it. And it shows the federal government's in charge. We have power. And keep in mind, this is a guy who literally led a war against tyrannical federal power, and here he is coming in with force to crush resistance in his new country. I bring this up to talk about the idea of John Locke, right? You can overthrow the government if they infringe upon your rights. Technically, right, you can overthrow the government right now, but the government's not going to let you. And that's this dividing line between what's a rebellion and a revolution. And look, take any of the protests going on in 2020. There's the thing of, well, we need to follow law and order, we need whatever. Remember, the Patriots were tarring and feathering people, they were burning people in effigy, and they were destroying public property, and they were quite literally destroying private property when it came for the Boston Tea Party. But they win. And then you look back on history and go, well, that was the right thing to do. We'll see what happens about what's going on in 2020, but that's kind of the situation we're at right now. I mentioned power the last time. The people in power don't want the people who are not in power to try and take that power from them, and they're holding on to it. The question is, all right, what do we as a society agree where that power should go? If we decide the power goes to the government, then guess what? The government's right in this case. If we agree that the power should go to the people, well, then the government is going to have to give up some of that power. And then those protesters will be viewed as being right. So Washington has served 2 terms. He does not want to run a third, and he does not want to win a third because he's concerned that, he's getting older. What if he dies? Then he could set the precedent that, you can serve as president until you die, which is what a king does. And he doesn't want that to be the case. So he purposefully steps aside. He says, I'm only going to serve 2 terms. Now, there is no term limit in the Constitution at this point, but the people who follow after Washington are like, well, Washington was a better person than I was, so I will follow in his thing, and I will only serve 2 terms. You are going to see some changes to that, though. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to serve 3+ terms, and he dies in his 4th term, and America goes, oh, this was a mistake, because we were literally involved in the Second World War. And so we will pass a restriction. There are now 2 terms. Now, I know Trump has floated something recently about how he can serve 3 terms. He cannot. He can't. It's in the Constitution. You get 2 terms. Washington gives a farewell address, and he sets up a couple of things that he's concerned about. 1, he's concerned about the growth of factions or political parties that he's seeing. These Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. He's afraid that that's going to steer the conversation away from America and into these, specific political parties, and people are going to get settled into one, and then they fight each other. And he's like, I'm worried about that. And America's like, nah, dude. And I give you today. He's also worried about a growing sectional tension between the North and the South. Maybe this is going to divide America and split us apart. And America's like, nah, man. And the Civil War. He also warns against entangling ourselves in foreign alliances. He says you can trade with people, absolutely. But if you make an alliance, then that means you don't get to control when you have to go fight conflicts. If another country gets involved in one, you have to go support them. And we kind of follow this for a little bit. Now, obviously we don't anymore, but we kind of do for a little while. The election of 1796 is between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and it's really close. But John Adams, the vice president, wins the election. John Adams is going to be the last one we deal with in this unit. So the question, how did John Adams' presidency reveal increasing tensions between political parties in the late 18th century? So let's compare these people a little bit. George Washington was a Federalist, although kind of in name only, right? He supported the federal government, but he wasn't really a political party fervent. He's a Southerner, he's very popular, and he's a war hero. And then you contrast that with John Adams. John Adams is a Federalist, and more significantly than Washington. He is from New England, so the North, and he's a lawyer. He's an intellectual person. He's not this, war hero. The first problem Adams is going to face as president involves France, so foreign policy. France is mad. Remember, the Jay's Treaty favored the British. It allowed the British to seize goods going to French ports. And so they start seizing American ships. Great. So John Adams decides, I'm going to send diplomats over to France and we're going to solve this thing. And this is ultimately going to lead to something called the Xyz Affair. And it is going to have a huge shape on what John Adams' presidency will be about. So when the American delegation shows up, we are expecting to be, formally invited into the country, and we're going to be brought before the delegates in charge, yada, yada, that whole thing. There's a certain amount of respect to that. Remember, we are our own country now. You will treat us with respect. And what happens is there are 3 French delegates, and we don't know their names, so they're called X, Y, and Z. And they meet these American delegates first. Now, we're expecting a foreign minister. We don't get that. We get these XYZ people. And basically, they solicit a bribe in order for us to meet with this foreign minister. Now, on its face, we go, okay, turn it down. Call someone, whatever. But this is a very big deal. We are our own country. You did not treat us with respect. Americans get so mad. How dare you treat us this way? And there becomes a lot of anti-French fervor. So, anti-French, French people are bad. French people are bad, immigrants are bad. And so now we have this negative view of foreign people. And it's going to lead to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Federalists see foreign-born people and Republican ideas as dangerous to the United States. So they want to take action to prevent those things from happening. So in 1798, they passed these series of Alien and Sedition Acts through Congress because they control Congress and the presidency. It can take 5 to 14 years to become a citizen. You can deport or jail dangerous aliens. And there is a fine or jail time if you speak out ill against really the Federalist Party. If you criticize John Adams, fine, or jail. If you criticize the Federalist Congress, fine, or jail. This clearly is against the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So we're finally seeing, and it hasn't taken very long, the federal government overstepping the bounds that they are supposed to be within. Obviously, you can assume Thomas Jefferson is not a fan of this. So there's going to be something called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions, which will be written by Madison and Jefferson. And basically, they're going to lay out an ideology that is going to be persistent up until the Civil War. So they don't like the Alien Sedition Acts because, well, that's against the Constitution, which is a problem. And they come up with a concept called the Principle of Nullification. So nullify means to cancel or void something. And so what they do is they go, all right, the federal government, which we can't control because we're not in power, has created a law that is unconstitutional. So the states should be allowed to ignore those laws or nullify them. And this brings into question who's in charge. Is it the federal government or the states? Now, the Democratic Republicans go, the states are in charge. And the Federalists say the federal government's in charge. And the Federalists are controlling the federal government, which would make sense why they align with that. But the Democratic Republicans are like, look, that is against the law. What are we going to do? We just won't follow it. And there's going to be this showdown between the federal government and the states. Where does that power lie? Now, ultimately, we're going to know because of the Civil War that nullification is not a thing states can do. The federal government is the supreme law of the land. However, we're not there yet. This is just one of many steps along that path of this tension between the federal government and the states. This will lead to increased tensions between these political parties, and you will have the same two people run again in 1800. And oh boy, is this a mudslinging election. I can't link the video in here, but if you go to YouTube and you type in election of 1800 political ads, there's a video on there that takes the actual words that they wrote about each other, but puts them into advertisements. And oh boy, if you thought 2016 was bad, this was really bad. Thomas Jefferson wins. And we have for the first time a peaceful transition of power. We call this the Revolution of 1800. We go from having a Federalist president to a Democratic Republican president. And no one killed each other, no one fought a war, it just happened. That's really unique in world history for one group of people to voluntarily, well, maybe not voluntarily, but give up power to another side because they lost an election. But John Adams is still the president for a little while. It's called the lame duck period. Jefferson hasn't been sworn in yet. And so what Adams does is he tries to pack all the courts, and he just starts pushing out federal list judges. Stop me if you've 2020. This is going to lead to the case of Marbury versus Madison, which we'll deal with on the other side of the other unit. But that is going to give us the policy of judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional.